Most people think they understand the global economy, that it is driven by supply and demand, productivity and competition. But what if the real engine of wealth has been quietly redirected by policies the public never notices? And what if a single event, decades ago, planted the seed of a mystery that still determines who gets rich today and who stays struggling without ever knowing why? The story starts not with bankers or politicians, but with a slow shift in how nations defined economic power. A shift that transformed money from a physical resource to a tool of influence, giving those who controlled the rules the power to shape the world without ever firing a shot. It began when countries realized that controlling the value of their currency was just as powerful as controlling their armies. And as global trade expanded after World War II, the United States, Europe, and a rise in Asia built institutions that seemed designed for cooperation, but quietly created hierarchies that funneled wealth upward. When the international monetary system first took shape under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the world believed it was establishing fairness, yet beneath the surface it locked countries into a structure where some currencies, especially the US dollar, became gatekeepers of global transactions, granting their policymakers leverage that ordinary citizens never voted on. For a while this system brought stability, but it also sowed dependence as nations tied their growth to the dollar, hoping that the promises of global cooperation would outweigh the risks of centralizing so much financial gravity in one currency. By the late 1960s, things were already unraveling, though very few recognized the signs. Inflation, foreign wars, and rising deficits pushed the United States to a breaking point, and the decision that followed, closing the gold window, would permanently detach money from physical value and attach it to nothing but trust. When President Nixon announced the end of $2 gold convertibility, the world instantly entered a new era. But most citizens simply saw it as a technical policy change, unaware that it had opened the door to a global experiment where currencies could be manipulated, expanded, and weaponized in ways impossible before. Once money became abstract, financial institutions grew more powerful, for they now had the freedom to create credit on a scale never imagined, and governments learned they could stimulate economies by expanding debt rather than improving productivity. This new world rewarded those who understood how to use leverage and punished those who relied on wages. Because, as credit expanded, asset prices, stocks, real estate, commodities rose exponentially, benefiting investors while workers' earnings stagnated. Through the 1980s and 1990s, deregulation accelerated this divide. Major economies loosened rules on banks, opened borders for capital flows, and sold the idea that free markets would lift all boats. But in reality, the waves lifted only the largest ships, while millions drifted behind. The introduction of global supply chains intensified the effect, as manufacturing moved to cheaper regions, boosting corporate profits, but eroding middle-class jobs in developed countries, creating a hidden transfer of wealth disguised as efficiency. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank became architects of economic discipline for developing nations, offering loans tied to strict conditions that often force countries to cut public programs, reduce subsidies, and privatize industries, shifting wealth from governments to foreign investors. These structural adjustment programs were defended as necessary reforms, yet many nations emerged weaker, more indebted, and more dependent on international markets, showing how global policies could reshape entire economies while citizens watched their living standards shrink without understanding why. Then came the early 2000s, when low interest rates and financial innovation produced a housing boom that seemed like a miracle, convincing millions that wealth was finally accessible to everyday families. Though the complexity of financial derivatives masked a danger no one fully grasped. When the housing bubble burst in 2008, it exposed a fragile system stacked on leverage, speculation, and unregulated risk, triggering a global collapse that wiped out jobs, savings, and homes. Yet the institutions that caused the crisis were rescued, while ordinary people suffered the consequences. Central banks responded with unprecedented money creation, quantitative easing, hoping to stabilize markets. But what it actually did was inflate asset prices once again, handing enormous wealth gains to investors, while wage earners recovered slowly, if at all. This period marked a turning point, for citizens realized that the wealthiest individuals and corporations seemed protected regardless of failure, While workers bore the losses, yet few understood that this was not an accident, it was the predictable outcome of policies built to stabilize markets rather than households. As the world recovered unevenly, global corporations grew larger than ever, using tax loopholes offshore, centers, and aggressive lobbying to shape regulations in their favor, deepening the divide between those who benefit from global policy and those who simply live under it. By the mid-2010s, wealth inequality had reached levels not seen in a century, with studies showing that the richest 1% owned more wealth than the bottom half of the global population. But public debates framed this as a moral issue rather than a structural one. In reality, every major shift from deregulation to monetary expansion to trade agreements had cumulatively built a system where wealth naturally flowed upward, not because people worked less or more, but because policy rewrote the rules of reward. Then came the pandemic, a global shock that once again revealed the true mechanics of modern economics. Markets crashed, governments intervened with massive stimulus, and central banks printed more money in a single year than in the previous decade combined. Yet even during a crisis that affected everyone, wealth distribution was anything but equal. Billionaires saw record gains. Stock markets surged after the initial crash, and corporations consolidated power while small businesses faced closures and workers endured unstable employment. This pattern was no coincidence. Stimulus money flowed into financial systems faster than into labor markets, and asset holders benefited first and most, demonstrating once again that global policy shapes wealth long before it reaches the public. Even after the crisis, inflation surged worldwide, driven partly by supply shocks, but also by the enormous expansion of money supply, and while citizens blamed prices, the deeper cause remained hidden behind layers of financial decisions made by institutions few can name. Attempts at reform emerged, promises of corporate regulation, tax restructuring, and new financial oversight, but these efforts repeatedly stalled or were watered down by political pressure, revealing how deeply entrenched the beneficiaries of the system had become. Meanwhile, emerging economies struggled under rising interest rates as the dollar strengthened, making foreign debt more expensive and reinforcing the decades-old problem of global financial dependency rooted in the original post-war system. Today, the consequences of all these phases echo loudly: extreme inequality, volatile markets, geopolitical tensions, currency wars, and a global population increasingly frustrated, yet unaware of how the rules were written without their knowledge. The mystery raised at the start, how wealth shifts, while citizens remain blind, now has a clearer answer. The world economy is not a natural system, but a constructed one shaped by policies, institutions, and agreements that determine who benefits long before the public ever feels the impact. The uncomfortable truth is that inequality is not a failure of the system. In many ways, it is a feature produced by the very mechanisms designed to stabilize markets and promote growth, even when those mechanisms leave millions behind. So what should viewers take away from this complex story? First, global economic policies matter more to personal wealth than individual effort alone ever can. Second, financial structures created decades ago still shape your opportunities today. Third, economic power lies not in money itself, but in who controls the rules surrounding it. As the world heads toward new uncertainties, digital currencies, shifting alliances, rising interest rates, and technological disruption, the next major transformation may already be underway. Driven again by decisions made far from public view, whether this coming shift concentrates wealth further or finally corrects long-standing imbalances depends on how aware citizens choose to become, because understanding the system is the first step to influencing it. If this deep dive opened your eyes to the hidden forces shaping global wealth, consider subscribing so we can explore these economic truths together, one story at a time.